Today I'm going to start by looking at something completely different. Let me go to a short essay by Zak Stein with a foreword by Jonathan Rosen. And I'm more or less going to go straight into it. It's going to be called Education is the Metacrisis. So yes, that's what we're talking about. A lot of people are going to freak out about that. I'm going to start talking about it anyway. Let me see. So this is from Perspectiva Press, which is their Jonathan Rosen's publishing organization. Education is the Metacrisis. Why it's time to see the planetary crises as a species-wide learning opportunity. Zak Stein. Zak Stein is a philosopher of education, working at the interface of psychology, metaphysics, and politics. He's published 2 books, including Education in a Time Between Worlds, along with dozens of articles. He's worked co-founding a nonprofit and think tank, teaching grad students at Harvard and consulting with tech startups. Zach's a long-time meditator, musician, caregiver, which has shaped him more than any professional engagements. Find out more about Zach's work easily online. And there's no bio for Jonathan Rosen, but we'll press on into his forward. This essay was first published on Perspectiva's previous website in December 2019 under a different title. Quote, if education is not the answer, you're asking the wrong question. We're reissuing it now in early 2022 as part of our new essay series to help bring it the consideration it deserves, and because it provides some of the theorizing that supports the arguments in a more recent essay by Zach that we're publishing at the same time. Quote, education must make history again, remembering Comenius in a time between worlds, which I might also do. The playful and profound analysis in Education is the Metacrisis helps the reader reimagine education from a significantly more expansive perspective than they may be used to, and connects that to the psychological and spiritual crises lying behind our major social and ecological challenges. One way of characterizing the metacrisis. Through Zach's work, the very idea of education is profoundly and helpfully defamiliarized, such that the word does not refer primarily to the conventional arcana featuring classrooms and exams, but becomes the beating heart of intergenerational transmission and social autopoiesis, the fundamental matter of how society maintains, renews, and transforms itself. That emphasis is of no small importance in this historical moment, where there is so much precarious excitement. Much is asked of us all. There's so much to lose, and so much is up for grabs. Okay, so basically, let's focus on the way that education is sort of central to the metacrisis. Okay, great. Again, I'm going to be trying to simplify. Maybe, I hope that doesn't sound condescending. I'm just trying to put it in black and white terms. Okay. In that context, the initial purpose of education is the metacrisis was to begin to outline the intellectual foundations of an initiative Perspectiva was launching at the time called the Transformative Educational Alliance, or T. That was supported by JJ Charitable Trust and Fetzner Institute, and it was grounded in Jonathan Rosen's own work on Bildung for the Center for the Understanding of Sustainable Prosperity at the University of Surrey, and also in Thomas Bjorkman's work. The project also arose partly as a response to an exacting reflection of the philosopher Thomas Metzinger, who argued in his essay on spirituality and intellectual honesty that anthropogenic climate change clearly seems to exceed the present cognitive and emotional abilities of the species. Here, climate change being understood as the metacrisis. Well, I'm substituting that. To a developmentally informed mind, that statement recasts our ecological challenges as being at least partly about an educational imperative to fashion and facilitate the emergence of such abilities at scale. The T initiative was therefore about institution building and collaboration, around the kinds of education that really matter, and about fulfilling Perspectiva's organizational commitment to support not just insight, but also praxis, realization, and emergence. The tea is still warm. The premises of the project are very much alive. But due to capacity challenges and time-sensitive opportunities, including Perspectiva's book publishing commitments, our leading role in creating the Realization Festival and COVID-19, the impetus behind tea was set aside, and the initiative has been dormant. Yet, anyway, let's go to the essay now. That was from Jonathan Rosen. Okay. Thank you, Jonathan Rosen. Now, what does Zach Stein have to say? Education is the metacrisis. Why it's time to see planetary crises as a species-wide learning opportunity. Published in, again, 2022. Republished 2022. First section, it's only about 10 pages. So, the coming planetary paideia. I'm going to check how to pronounce that. It's paideia. So, paideia is a Greek term, which is the etymological root for words such as encyclopedia and Wikipedia. Encyclopedia, Wikipedia. Paideia, okay. The word has a range of connotations, but largely has to do with the raising of youth and the intergenerational transmission of virtues, knowledge, and skill. In ancient Athens, the creation and maintenance of a collective paideia was understood as an educational and cultural task taking place prior to the tasks of building a coherent polity. Education is prior to politics and thus prior to civilization. Education, the praxis that is our paideia, is the deep code of both politics and civilization. Changes in the shape and nature of our collective paideia are more radical than, and ultimately the cause of, any and all political revolutions. In my book, Education in a Time Between Worlds, I weave together a set of 6 essays on the future of education by making use of a single idea. We are living in an historical epoch when the nature of education itself is changing. We are witnessing the emergence of a planetary paideia that is polycentric, meaning having many centers, decentralized, and philosophically integral, whatever that is supposed to mean. The so-called global village is at risk of turning into something like a shopping mall of planetary scope, but I argue that it could instead be transformed into a planetary, quote, school without walls. Indeed, I think this is a highly probable scenario. This world historical transformation in the nature of our collective paideia is going to take, and is already taking, many varied forms. But the directionality of the change is clear. The necessity of the change is also clear. I argue that there is no viable future for civilization that does not include a radical change in the nature of our education systems. For example, in my book, I outline a near-future design fiction scenario for educational innovation in the US, which I discuss as the Educational Hub Network. The basic idea is that school systems themselves need to be repurposed and redesigned. I suggest that each school building be transformed into an unprecedented institution that is some combination of a public library, museum, co-working center, computer lab, and daycare. Funded to the hilt and staffed by citizen teacher scientists, these public and privately supported educational hubs would be the local centers of regionally decentralized pop-up classrooms, community organizing, apprenticeship networks, and college and work preparation counseling. Giant schools built on the model of the factory at the turn of the last century can be gutted, remodeled, and reborn, metaphorically and literally, to create the meta-industrial one-room schoolhouses of the future. In this new form of public space dedicated to education, digital technologies will enable the formation of peer-to-peer networks of students and teachers of all ages, from all across the local region or the world digitally, all without coercion or compromise. What enables these safe and efficient hubs of self-organizing educational configurations are fundamentally new kinds of educational technologies, which put almost unlimited knowledge in the palm of every person's hand. I wrote these ideas under the frame of concrete utopian thinking as a kind of speculative exercise to spark the social imagination. But since publishing the book, I've been contacted by numerous people who are already working on some version of this idea. It seems that there is a logic to the development and evolution of the collective paideia, as innovations are taking place along certain common vectors of change. The tides are turning to some extent, as there is a dawning awareness of just how potentially radical the possibilities are for educational initiative in our historical moment. One of the people who resonated with my thinking about the emergence of a planetary paideia was Jonathan Rowson. He alerted me to the ongoing efforts of a growing Bildung movement, in which he and others in Europe have been independently discovering and experimenting with the kind of ideas I was writing about in my book. We could both see that something was trying to emerge, something like an alliance, concerning the radical changes taking place in our collective paideia. Naturally, as happens when someone from New England gets together with someone from the UK, we decided to make tea. This is the first of several concept papers about the scope and mission of the Transformative Education Alliance, or T, which is an effort undertaken here at Perspectiva in conjunction with a, quote, pan-European Bildung education network, as well as a host of sites in North America. This series of concept papers is intended to put in place the code upon which T will run, intending only to establish the minimum set of ideas needed for the creation of an alliance. T will eventually come to life on the ground in communities all over the world, but the first step is to understand the work that needs to be done. Zak Stein continues. Education is the metacrisis. There are a large number of crises drawing increasing amounts of public attention, such as the ecological, economic, immigration, geopolitical, and energy crises. We can also now add, risks from weapons technology, including biotechnology and AI to that list, among many other risks anyway. But there is also an invisible crisis unfolding within our own minds and cultures that is getting much less attention. This is the metacrisis, which has to do with how humans understand themselves and the world. It is a generalized educational crisis involving a set of related psychological dynamics. Systems and societies are in trouble. But it is the psyche, the human dimension, that is in the direst of straits. There is a vicious cycle that characterizes states of crisis, precipitating a cascade into catastrophic and profound confusion. You may have experienced this if you've ever been truly lost, especially alone in the woods on foot. Regardless of the difficulty of the actual physical and technical problems that need to be solved for you to survive and find your way again, there is the primary difficulty of simply keeping your head on straight. Failing to do this means you may be unable to learn what your situation actually is. As when, out of fear, you make a snap decision that camp is that way and set out running. You're now running in the wrong direction and exhausting yourself. The crisis was that you misplaced your map and got lost, but the metacrisis that made it go from bad to worse was in your head. The same lesson applies at the social cultural level, where today we are without a map and lost in objective crises, including ecosystems, infrastructures, borders, and bombs. There is a tendency toward action bias as the situation heats up. The desperate desire for a map will lead to situations where anything resembling a map will do. We then set metrics in place even when we do not know what should be measured, just to feel like we are making progress. Worse than flying blind, we are flying using instruments as if they work, when in reality they do not, i.e., camp is that way. When social systems enter these dynamics, it is, of course, more complicated than being alone and lost in the woods. Large groups of people have to continue to cooperate and solve problems, even as the sense grows on the whole that we are lost. We are lost. Welcome to the Metacrisis. This is a generalized educational crisis in which, despite all the concrete problems faced by society, the most pressing problems are actually in our heads, i.e., in our minds and souls. We are in a crisis of the psyche. We are in a crisis of the psyche. This can be made clear by differentiating out the following 4 aspects. 1. Sense-making crisis. What is the case? What is the case? Confusion at the level of understanding the nature of the world. Everyday people and experts are struggling to say things that are true, unable to comprehend increasing complexity. The worst case scenario is a complete epistemic unmooring and a descent into the cultural vertigo of an inescapable simulation. The best case scenario sees emergent forms of post-digital, individual, and collective sense-making spreading on a massive scale. That was number 1, sense-making crisis. Number 2, capability crisis. How can it be done? How can it be done? Incapacity at the level of operating on the world intelligently. In all social positions and domains of work, individuals are increasingly unable to engage in problem solving to the degree needed for continued social integration. The worst case scenario results in catastrophic infrastructure failure due to a brain power shortage. The best case scenario is a revivification of guilds and technical educational initiatives for a new economics of social system integration. That was number 2, capability crisis. Number 3, legitimacy crisis. Who should do it? Incoherence at the level of cultural agreements. Political and bureaucratic forms of power are failing to provide sufficiently convincing rationale and justification for trust in their continued authority. The worst case scenario is complete citizen-level defection from all organized political bodies. The best case scenario sees new forms of governance and collective choice-making that are built out from first principles, factoring in dynamics that are digital and planetary. That was number 3, legitimacy crisis. Number 4, meaning crisis. Why? Why do it? Inauthenticity at the level of personal experience. Individuals from all walks of life are questioning the purpose of their existence, the goodness of the world, and the value of ethics, beauty, and truth. The worst case scenario is peak alienation and a total mental health crisis. The best case scenario would allow for a democratization of enlightenment, sanity, and psychological sovereignty. So we just broke down 4 aspects of the metacrisis, conceived by Zak Stein as on the sort of interiority dimension, particularly in relation to education. And those different aspects were the sense-making crisis, what is the case? The capability crisis, how can it be done? The legitimacy crisis, who should do it? And the meaning crisis, why do it? Zak Stein continues with the next section, making tea in a time between worlds. The Transformative Education Alliance, or T, is motivated by an awareness of the metacrisis, which is understood as generalized educational challenge and opportunity for evolving the foundations of our collective paideia. The 4 aspects of the metacrisis are to be understood as needing to be addressed by necessity. They are essential to any coherent paideia. All 4 aspects are interconnected You cannot answer one without also providing answers for the other three. Indeed, the failure of modern education has to do with its only answering two of the four aspects, as I discussed below. Nevertheless, answers to these questions, resolutions across all aspects of the educational crisis, are necessary for the continuity of social forms and thus civilization itself. Jürgen Habermas clarified the educational nature of social autopoiesis in the 1970s, and it has been deepened and confirmed ever since, including by Martha Nussbaum and others in the domain of legal and political thought. The basic idea is that societies require each new generation to be in a position to inherit the requisite capabilities, legitimacy, and meaning-making to continue the project of cooperative social life. Duh, but anyway. This entails that societies have some large percentage of their adult members actively working to maintain sophisticated educational projects. Again, this entails that societies have some large percentage of their adult members actively working to maintain sophisticated educational projects. Failing this, the intergenerational fabric of the social world begins to fray. At some point, inadequate education results in an inability to fill essential institutional roles, provide motivating meanings, and secure political legitimacy. Most educational efforts are usually offering answers to only one of these questions. When there is mention of an educational crisis, it's usually in reference to one of these four aspects, most often capability, the how question. Public school STEM curricula were explicitly built to address the capability crisis, as this is the aspect that is legible according to the terms set by the guiding philosophy of human capital theory. According to this argument, the economy is seen as flagging because educational systems are failing. This is a crisis of job preparedness and 21st century skills, where the focus is on the ability of people to do the jobs that need doing in order for the social system to work. Almost orthogonal to these trends, the human potential movement has been addressing the meaning crisis, along with much of progressive and holistic education, as well as depth psychology generally, depth psychotherapy in general. We encounter this outside of schools or in alternative schools, where your job should be the last thing on your mind, or at least where your soul is more important than your job. There has been a return to meaning, spirituality, and various forms of religiously framed but secularly held personal growth and self-development work. This is education for its own sake, which is to make someone whole and capable of living a richly meaningful life. Of course, for nearly a century, the major educational force has been the modern public schools themselves. These have been the largest educational initiatives in history and can be understood as having been invented as a means for generating political legitimacy and instilling sense-making about the nature of the world for this end. Science and nationalism replaced religion and ethnocentrism, and the idea that a particular form of government is natural, i.e., good and the best possible, was made fit for mass consumption through the pedagogy of mass schooling. Electronic media, starting with radio and then TV, changed these dynamics entirely, as sense-making and legitimacy were brought over from didactic instruction into the images and fantasies of the voice and screen. If PBS and Sesame Street represent the best potentials of this shift, well, then Fox News and CNN represent the worst. Digital technologies changed the game on all four aspects entirely, a point to which I will return below. Note that an answer to one aspect of the metacrisis entails an answer to them all, even if this answer is not explicit. Imagine training a bunch of scientists while providing no sense of meaning for their lives. Or imagine giving people rich sources of meaning, but never teaching them to do math or operate any kind of machines or organizations. It should be clear that both of those scenarios have been tried, at least in part, during modernity, and the approach is self-defeating. Scientists living meaningless lives create monstrosities. De-skilled people whose meanings are dictated to them become sheep-like. Piecemeal approaches that address only one aspect of the fourfold educational crisis are multiplying and piling up, and many of them could be making things worse. Modern approaches to education have been exhausted. There are no longer any agreed upon answers to the basic questions that have long been at the heart of intergenerational transmission. A postmodern confusion has set in, which cannot last because these questions about the social world cannot remain unanswered. We are in a time between worlds, and it is disorienting. We are in a time between worlds, and it is disorienting. The resolution of the metacrisis, or arrival in the quote new world, appears almost unimaginable. Because each of the four aspects of the metacrisis requires a resolution that is intertwined with the resolution of all others. Sense-making aids meaning-making, which aids legitimacy, which helps build capability, and so on, in all directions and combinations. If there is not this kind of complex educational system, this coherent and comprehensive paideia, then eventually things fall apart, as the saying goes, and the center of the social world cannot hold. In the evolutionary dynamics of complex systems, there is a tendency for these systems to lose their center of balance. This is a crisis. Something new needs to and will emerge all at once. As a fundamentally new kind, life makes itself possible. As a fundamentally new kind that life itself makes possible. Or the exhausted form of life will simply end. And that's all she wrote. Where she is nature. When considering the evolution of educational systems, we must ask ourselves, what is coming next? What is coming next? What is coming next? The next section goes, prefiguring the first of what is next. T is not being made to answer these questions, nor to solve the educational crisis according to the terms by which it was created. Indeed, there are no answers on hand, because these are uncharted educational frontiers. T is interested in networking, curating, and supporting educational environments and resources that will prepare people to be able to address the fourfold crisis for themselves, as individuals and as communities. This must be done in time, before the old forms of education entirely lose force. There is no polity without a coherent paideia, no society without the educational resources necessary to keep it running. T seeks to forestall as best as possible a catastrophic disruption of intergenerational transmission in the short run, while working to build a fundamentally new kind of education system that could exist over the long run. The four aspects of the metacrisis frame the work being undertaken by T. They help organize the best of the best in a synoptic and retrospective way. As mentioned above, there are already numerous and important efforts underway that address one or two aspects of the fourfold crisis in various ways. T is seeking to clarify the history of such efforts, as well as to build an understanding concerning which of the fourfold aspects are currently being worked on, by whom, and with what kinds of quality and tools. This allows us to mitigate some of the impending educational disaster waiting on our doorstep. To be clear, when thinking about the problems of education today, it is not simply that we need more of it. Indeed, more education, as we've known it, could be a problem. Current educational configurations come in many varieties. This is a partial list, in no particular order, of varieties of current educational configurations, which he lists as, somewhat idealistically, transformative progressive, alternative, holistic, constructivist, outdoor, place-based didactic, traditionalist integral, gamification, techno-optimist, ecocentric, activist, agriculture, nature-based, social justice, the anti-racism and LGBTQ stuff, embodiment or movement, mindfulness, project-based, portfolio-based, interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, and fundamentalist religious. Seems like a somewhat partial list, but anyway, let's keep going. That was a list of the varieties of current educational configurations. And he goes on. The four aspects of the metacrisis outlined above can be used to ensure a kind of clarity of attention when considering the current educational landscape. Many of these approaches are clearly capable of bringing great benefits to great numbers. However, it's also clear that any single approach is not enough to address the fourfold metacrisis entirely. T seeks to decenter every position in order to then weave the polycentric meshwork needed to shore up the failing educational institutions that have come to dominate our society. Certain best-in-class work across all areas of the educational establishment should be continued, but these efforts should take up a discerning division of labor with regards to the four aspects of the metacrisis outlined above. The aggregation and constellation of approaches that might otherwise be in competition and rivalry is one of the things T is seeking to accomplish. The best of the best within the current educational landscape needs help to self-organize with a shared sense of purpose and right relationship to various aspects of the metacrisis. However, constellating the best of the best is different from getting a handle on the first of the next. The primary work that T is seeking to undertake is that of clarifying the shape of what is emerging in a preferable future for educational innovation. Fostering the creation of new ideal types and design innovations for the future of education is non-routine work, which is outside the realms of normal science in the Kuhnian sense. T is an alliance moving through the space between paradigms, not one representing a new paradigm. T is engaged in a kind of valley crossing or evolutionary scouting, which is a preamble or reconnaissance prior to the establishment of the new normal. Last page. In a time between worlds, there is the possibility for true novelty and emergence. Best of the best of today must form a meshwork of differentiated answers. These answers must cover a fragmented array of institutional niches in an attempt to immediately mitigate educational disaster, essential but temporary. Transcending but including this, others must consider their work as prefiguring the first of the next, examples of a new emergent form. Not a meshwork tailored to the current institutional and social terrain, but something that offers answers to all four aspects in one educational undertaking. This requires making use of truly novel technologies and pedagogies, processes, practices, and community forms, many of which have no place in most of what counts as education today. The first of what is next is edgy, emergent, and complex. What is arising now along this trajectory is most certainly not the best of what will characterize our future world. But there is a real need to start somewhere, to begin the experiment with the evolution of educational forms. T is brewing for the future of transformative education. Transformative education, used here as a loose translation of the German Bildung, has long been a term associated with advocacy and sometimes prophecy for a form of education that undertakes to transform individual sense-making and capabilities, i.e. development, not mere learning, within contexts of political and cultural engagement. This is the transformation of self and worldview in community, in service of the world, and carried out on the scale of society itself through a publicly supported infrastructure. Such a vision was one of the dignities of modernity left to us by the Romantics and Idealists. This history will concern us in later writings. The point here is the basic code for transformation being written into T as follows. Quote, Individual transformations of sense-making and capability done in the context of political and cultural engagement, with an understanding of the fourfold metacrisis and the role of education in a time of planetary transformation. And this can be contrasted with the code written into modern public education, which is something like this, quote, individual transformations of sense-making and capability done in the context of abstract work that is isolated from the rest of politics and culture, undertaken with an understanding of the needs of the nation state, and the role of human capital in the economy. The origins of this notion of modern public education are found in important ideas about what broadly available educational resources might accomplish. In the 18th century, the Prussian state was truly pioneering here, but the emergence of large-scale modern public educational bureaucracies was a result of a nationalistic downgrading of the philosophy of Bildung, which had emerged from the legacy of German idealism. This idea of transformative education has, in fact, been within the heart of Western civilization since the Renaissance-era humanists attempted to siphon off education from the church. The idea of public education itself was first spread through Europe in the 16th century by the Rosicrucian John Amos Comenius. Comenius argued for a philosophy of universal wisdom, pansophism, that entailed viewing humanity and society sub specie educationis, i.e., to see all of the human condition under the aspect of education. This is actually the place where the work of T begins, seeing education in a new way. Forthcoming concept papers will include the history of the idea of transformative education from Socrates to Comenius through Dewey and Montessori and up to today. We will then turn to a synoptic examination of what is currently the best of the best, which will allow us to decenter the contemporary scene in an effort to weave the minimum meshwork necessary to mitigate certain imminent educational failures. Only then will we begin T's true work, which is to organize and galvanize the first of the next, and to prefigure the shape of what preferable forms of educational innovation might look like. With the code of transformation outlined above as a guide, the work is that of navigating a time between worlds with compasses set toward a planetary paideia. Okay, that was Zak Stein's Education is the Metacrisis, and I am going to not comment. I'm going to leave it at that because I don't have anything more to say. Bye.